San Salvador Island on October 12, 1492, he had with him at least one Muslim and 3 Moriscos. Now, the term Morisco may be new to many of you here in the audience, so let me digress for a moment. 1492, Granada had just fallen. The Spanish Inquisition was in full steam. Massive religious persecution was going on against both Muslims and Jews in what had been Muslim Andalusia. The Catholic Church was persecuting, torturing, and killing Muslims. The Muslims in what then was Spain received a fatwa from North Africa that said you can go ahead and do a sham conversion to Christianity because you are in such danger. Just continue to practice your Islam in private. Those people, those Muslims who underwent this sham conversion and their descendants are known as Moriscos. So with that in mind, let's look at Columbus's voyage. The avowed Muslim that we know of was an African named Pedro Alonso Nino, and he helped navigate the Atlantic and map the islands of the Caribbean. The Moriscos were the 3 Pinzon brothers: Martin, who was captain of the Pinta, Vicente, who was captain of the Nina, and Francisco, who was a pilot of the Pinta. Columbus sailed with 3 ships. 2 of them were captained by Moriscos. In addition, one sailor, Rodrigo de Triana, also known as Rodrigo de Lepe, converted to Islam upon returning to Spain. Of note, he was the first person on Columbus's first voyage to sight land. We were there with Columbus, and we were there with the following Spanish conquistadors. Again, the Spanish Inquisition was going full steam in Spain, and many Muslims were looking for any way out from that country. One way out was to join the Spanish expeditions to the New World. And so Muslims were part and parcel of almost every one of the early Spanish explorations of the America. For example, we can point to Nuflo de Olano, who was an African Muslim who accompanied Vasco de Balboa in his expedition. But perhaps the most famous of all the Muslims to accompany the Spanish conquistadors was Estevanico of Azamor. Estevanico means Little Stephen in Spanish. And Estevanico of Azamor, you'll find his name in the history books fairly prominently. Spanish language movies have been made about Estevanico of Azamor. He's a very famous person. Of course, those history books and those movies typically fail to mention that he was a Muslim and that Estevanico was not his real name, it was his slave name. His real name was Mustafa Zamori. And Mustafa was a Muslim born around the year 1500 in Azamor, Morocco. By 1527, he was a slave to a Spaniard named Andres Dorantes. On July 17, 1527, Mustafa and his owner sailed from Spain to the New World. They reached the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean and joined the de Narvaez expedition of 5 ships and 500 to 600 men sailing to Florida. En route to Florida, this expedition was met with a hurricane. Some of the ships sank, losing all people on board. The surviving ships, upon landing in Florida, and the survivors disembarking from those ships, were immediately attacked by American Indians with a great loss of life. After that, Mustafa then led those who escaped the Indian attacks on a 5,000-mile westward journey on foot that took them through Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, and Mexico. The first person from the Old World to explore those states of the southeastern United States. By the time they reached Mexico City, Mustafa and only 3 others were still alive. But it wasn't just with the Spanish conquistadors. It was also with the early colonists. Consider the case of the Santa Elena colony. It was established in what is now South Carolina by Spain in 1566 and lasted for over 20 years. The early colonists, about 200 in number, were recruited from the Galician mountains in northern Spain and Portugal. This geographic area was heavily populated by Muslims and Moriscos, and it can be safely assumed that many of these Santa Elena colonists were in fact Muslims. It's also known that Spain settled Turkish Muslims who were silk and textile workers in Cuba, Mexico, Florida, and the American Southwest during the 16th centuries. But it wasn't just Spain. It was also Great Britain. During the 17th century, England settled Turkish Muslims, also silk workers, in the British colony of Jamestown, Virginia. The earliest written documentation of Turkish Muslims being in Jamestown is found in the year 1631. In fact, these Turkish Muslims became so numerous in Jamestown that the colony of Virginia passed a law prohibiting the importation of any more Turkish Muslims into the colony. We were there. We were there all along. And we also built the agricultural base of the American South. In one of the saddest chapters of American history, the agricultural base of the American South was built on the backs and the blood of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Of the approximately 20 million enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas, approximately 20 to 30% were Muslims. And many of these 4 to 6 million enslaved Muslims were highly educated. Many of them were scholars and imams, and at least one was a sharif, a direct lineal descendant of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. For years, small county museums in the American South had what they thought was sort of magical scribbling done by some African slaves centuries ago. In the last half century, scholars have started going into these small museums and looking at what's there. And what they have found is entire Qurans written in Arabic from memory by these slaves. Entire books of fiqh written from memory in Arabic by these slaves. Some historians are now estimating that the percentage of literacy amongst the slaves was actually higher than the percentage of literacy among the slave owners. It's just that the slaves' literacy was in Arabic and the slave owners was in English. In my book, Muslims in American History, I present 27 brief biographies of these enslaved Muslims in America. Let me share just a couple of them with you. The first concerns Jerald Dirks. He was born in Africa around 1686 to 1707. Sources differ as to when he was actually born. He was enslaved and arrived in Maryland sometime around the year 1731, where he was purchased by the Bell family and put to work making bricks. Apparently, after building a brick home for the Bells did something that was most unusual in the American South. They freed Jerald Dirks. This did not happen very often. But given his freedom, Jerald Dirks continued to live in the area around what is today Washington, D.C. And accounts written about him at the time document that he was extremely well-liked and admired by all who knew him. Those accounts also document the fact that he could be observed publicly walking down the streets and singing praises to Allah. And when the time came